So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Warren. I'm the Regional Manager of LabourNet, and I'd just like to welcome you to our webinar regarding the link between good governance and corporate culture. So whilst our clients typically know about employer relations, especially being LabourNet clients, and building a healthy culture, few may understand how it's supported by good governance. So we're proud to be hosting this webinar in conjunction with SERDAR, Africa's leading boardroom partner. So today's speaker is Roger Hitchcock, and he's a governance expert who has spent 12 years training directors across Africa and has more than 30 years of business experience in family business, corporate, non-profit, and entrepreneurial endeavors. Roger has also personally held a number of directorships, so he speaks from a real lived boardroom experience. So Roger, thank you so much for being here and for your willingness to share your knowledge about this very important topic. And just before I hand over to you, Roger, if I could just ask some of the attendees, if you're happy just to drop your designation or title in the chat box, this could help Roger just know who's in the room, just from a position perspective. And then if there's any questions, guys, we do have someone in the background handling that, so please put some questions in the chat box, and I think we can also allow time at the end, if time permits, to verbally ask some questions. And with that, Roger, yeah, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Warren. Good to be here, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for this really interesting, critical topic. I'm presenting to you from Pretoria, which is quite cold and also probably a victim of load shedding. Well, is a victim of load shedding, so hopefully you can manage that. And fortunately, we don't have a generator buzzing in the background yet. As we go, I'd love you to, as Warren has said, just drop your designation into the chat box. I've got it in front of me, so if my eyes are reverted a bit during the course of the hour together, so I have the chat box open, I have the Q&A box open, so I'm happy to take questions. What I may also do, depending on the questions, is I may also use the flip chart behind me to elaborate on any points or comments or questions that come out as well. As Warren mentioned, I've been in the boardroom training space, working with boards throughout Africa for a number of years, and organizational culture, corporate culture, values, beliefs, norms, all of those associated words are really, really critical. Part of me says, when I look at the title, 7 Ways That Corporate Governance Supports Corporate Culture, recognizing that culture is a people issue, one almost change the topic slightly, because if we're talking about people, then it's better for us to talk not necessarily about corporate governance, but about corporate governors. And many of you in the roles that you're in, Ilani, Chief Financial Officer, I mean, you're in a governance role, even if it's a so-called operational role, because ultimately what governors do is they set the tone, they set the framework, they set the parameters for an organization to be well governed. And so I want to speak with that in mind. A little bit more about SERDAR, just a couple of minutes up front, is this picture of a finger pointing is important, because ultimately the role of directors, the role of the board and directors, to be pointing in a coherent and cohesive direction. The name SERDAR comes from the lead Sherpa in a mountain expedition. And so we believe that the board is ultimately the SERDAR of the business that it governs. And so the board needs to be pointing in the same direction. And too often in organizational culture, in the conversation around culture, boards point in different directions. By the way that they don't engage properly, don't demonstrate properly. Some of the key pointers that I want to pick up on today. Why is organizational culture becoming such a critical topic, a critical theme, not just for operations in business, but also from a governance perspective? Is because more and more individuals are making decisions based on alignment with belief, alignment with values, alignment ultimately with this concept of organizational culture. What you see in front of you is a really interesting survey that came out August 21. And you may know Edelman. Edelman does a very valuable trust barometer every single year. At the beginning of the year, they monitor the change in trust, and trust is a very powerful word, undergirding, supporting, leading to organizational culture, influenced by organizational culture. And the special report, and I thought it was really interesting that it came out during the pandemic. It was a question that became critical to be addressed, not just at the operational level, but throughout companies. This concept of, well, how do we make decisions? How are people in our businesses making decisions? Who are the people we need to take care of, focus on in our corporate environment or corporate ecosystem? And this report that came out was called the Belief-Driven Employee. And I encourage you to Google it, to download it, because it's a very valuable insight into how people are starting to think. The survey itself is significant. They survey a number of different countries, a number of different people. So normally their surveys consist of 30,000+ people. And some of the highlights of this were that, as per the header, employees are now powered by beliefs. And what that means, one of the questions they asked was, well, how do you choose your employer? How do you choose whether you stay, whether you leave? 61% of employees align with their employer or don't align based on beliefs. Very, very powerful. They choose, leave, avoid, or consider employers based on their beliefs and values. And that obviously is understanding this thing called organizational culture, because that's the basis of this decision. Ultimately, it's an alignment. Obviously, people want to work where they are able to apply their competencies and their capabilities, but more important is becoming this alignment about beliefs and values, which means that if boards of directors ignore this, it's really, really significant, because we are seeing words like the great, or phrases like the great resignation. And people are saying, why is that? Well, this is one of the big reasons for it, is that there is a misalignment often in terms of values and beliefs. Another key element is that we need to think about building trust through shared impact. More and more, culture is not just seen as this internal thing, but this thing that is expressed by a business to its outside, obviously the term is stakeholders. Yes, ultimately, trust is not what a company says it is, but trust is what other people outside of a business or outside of the core say about a company. That's what trust is based on. One of the key findings here is that it's really, really important for employers to walk the talk on values. So values and organizational culture is moving quite significantly away from this thing that is expressed on a list of values on a reception wall to what is actually demonstrated, what is seen, what is experienced in companies, as opposed to, as I said, what do we just say about ourselves? And so again, it's about alignment. The expectation and performance gap is significant in terms of what people expect the organization acts on its values, the expectation and the performance, and my values are reflected in the organization. Again, a gap between what I expect and what I see happening. And ultimately, it boils down to a couple of things. And then based on this, I'm going to get into some ideas or thoughts in terms of how can governors engage with culture. And this is really important. CEOs must ultimately embody the employer values, because people in a business look to someone, and if we think about it in terms of the board, a group of people to embody the values of the organization. And so there's this concept in organizational culture, we call it the measles and mumps effect, is that, and I'll maybe talk about it as the measles and COVID effect. I could be talking to you about, and if we were in the room and I was talking to you about measles, but I had COVID, what were you going to get? You were going to get COVID. And so it's not just the CEO, but it's ultimately also the board as well that needs to embody the values of the organization. In other words, where does organizational culture start? We often think of organizational culture or corporate culture as what we see at the base of the pyramid in a sense, but actually it starts somewhere else. And that's what I want to pick up on, is to say, well, what can a governing body, the board of governors, and I'm using this word governance and governors interchangeably because culture is a people issue. So what are some things the people around the boardroom table, the people at senior levels of the organization, so maybe those not just around the boardroom table, but those who are looked up to as the carriers of culture and not just the demonstrators of culture, because I'd argue that those at the bottom of the pyramid, in a sense, are the demonstrators of culture, because they're the ones at the coal face, engaging, interacting often. But it's those people who are sometimes more distant from it that actually have to think about and engage with organizational culture. There's 7 or 8 points that I want to make. As we said, this first thing about corporate culture that governors need to really grasp is they need to understand it. And organizational culture is this thing that is a combination of what is visible and what is invisible, what is tangible and what is intangible, what is in the front and what is, front of scene in a sense, and behind the scenes. And bridging that gap between those two things is really, really important. There are obviously key words that we use to describe some of these elements, and I like to put them on what I call the culture continuum. And there are ultimately, from a leadership point of view, there are 2 dimensions that leaders need to continually balance as they engage in their role of leadership. The one is the horizontal axis there, which is the axis in time, is that we lead towards something. We lead with foresight. We have to think about what the future holds and aim for that. When we oversee in the present, we are asking questions about what do we see today that is leading us into a desired future, whether we call that strategy or vision, numerous words for that. Certainly we look back and we learn, but while we're moving forward in time, we have this continual vertical that is on the move. And that vertical consists ultimately of, at the top, what are people demonstrating? What are they experiencing? So there's the inside out and the outside in a sense. The habits of the business that are determined or seen from the outside looking in. What do we do habitually? Whether it's good or bad, all of our organizations have habits, and those habits are the collective behaviors of the people. And there's something about above the line, the horizontal line is what's visible, what's tangible. Below the line is what's intangible, what's invisible. It's what we claim to be our values, and those values are what we claim to believe to be valuable, but actually the reality is reflected in our habits and our behaviors. We can put words on our wall, but unless they're reflected in aligned behaviors and habits, then what's the reality? The reality is ultimately what's visible and what's expressed. And this is where governors to really understand this concept of organizational culture. Understand conceptually what it's about, that it's not just about revising and reviewing a list of words. Things like excellence, things like professional, things like customer-centric. Those are words only unless they are filled with and made tangible. And so the key question that bridges the gap between the invisible, the beliefs and the values for each company is, what does that look like here? And governors are really, the key question that governors need to ask on an ongoing basis is, what does that look like here? We dig to understand our beliefs by asking ourselves why, but we create the tangible behaviors and habits by asking, what does that look like? One of the key things, and this is often where being distant from the company is not a good thing, because I think the second thing that governors can think about or can engage around organizational culture is to experience it. Ultimately, it's about walking around. It's about understanding what is experienced in the company, from the company. I often challenge directors to say, well, have you actually called? You can do it anonymously. Have you called your call center? Have you walked into your key parts of the business with, not with a warning, not with a positioning, but actually to go and experience it, not to catch people out, but to experience? Have you sat in one of your key areas of the business and just spent the time asking the question, what does this feel like? Because culture is something, we can put the words down, but culture is something that is experienced and not just something that is documented or described. And so the description is important afterwards, but it's important not just to understand conceptually what culture is, but to experience concretely what exists. You see, every company has a culture. Whether you got it formalized or not, there is a culture. Why? Because there is an ethos. There is something there is a disposition that exists already. And so really important for those who are distant from the coalface or the front of the business to actually experience it. And then understand what are the different aspects, as I mentioned, of culture. So corporate culture is broadly defined as being a number of different things. It's a set of shared things, which is an important word, but they're shared attitudes. So what are the things we carry in common throughout the organization? What are the shared behaviors? And are there shared behaviors that we have across our businesses? And obviously, some of you are in smaller organizations, some of you in larger organizations. And so culture would express itself in different ways, but is there a sharing, in a sense, of the behaviors, principles, and values that ultimately drive action and purpose? So, and you'll see in a couple of slides' time that there is a strong link between the values that we can't see and the actions that we can see. And if we don't think about that link and understand that link, then people will assume by the way that they see us acting what our values are. And based on that, it's really important, thirdly, to start asking questions around, so how do we talk about this thing called culture? It's one of those topics that is often seen as merely operational, and I put merely in inverted commas. In other words, boards think, well, it's not our baby because we are not the ones who deal with it on the ongoing basis. There's a really important word that is used in the governance space or the boardroom space around organizational culture. And the word or the phrase is called the tone at the top. And ultimately, directors set the tone at the top for everything that happens in a business. It happens in a family, it happens in a business, it happens in a country, is that people look to the leaders, whether those leaders are visible or invisible. They see the impact of leaders on them through the decisions that are made, communication about the decisions, the way decisions are implemented, the way activities are incentivized, all of those tools that help companies operate, whether they be through policies or packages or whatever tools they are, ultimately shape and mold culture and reflect culture. And so what boards and governors need to be doing is talking about it, is to ask the question, what are some of the aspects in our organization? What is it that some of the things we need to be thinking about if we are wanting to ultimately have a say in, affect, influence, do something about an organizational culture? Especially if there's something wrong, what do? We have to start by talking about it. And the danger is boards don't talk about it. A survey done a couple of years ago, and I don't think it's changed much. There's certainly a growing recognition of culture as being important at a governance level. But most directors are culture clueless. The survey showed that only 50% of directors understand the collective behaviors, norms, and values at the front lines of the organization. And so it's really important to ask, if we are setting the tone at the top, how do we ensure that the behavior at the bottom, and that's another phrase used in the kind of culture space, aligns with what we're expecting? A very powerful metaphor for that is that if you think about an orchestra, and one of the roles of the board is to set the tuning for the whole orchestra in that metaphor, is that orchestras tune to a single instrument. They don't tune to one another. And too often as boards or governors, we allow the company to tune to one another. And then we get, to use another metaphor, the broken telephone effect. If we're thinking that ultimately the orchestra of the company to be cohesive and coherent and to create a beautiful symphony needs to be tuned to one instrument, and that one instrument is the board. The instrument is the clarinet that orchestras typically tune to, because it creates a singular, easy to tune to note. And that's the thing governors need to ask as well. What are we doing? Because if we understand culture, we understand that it's the invisible things that ultimately determine the visible things. If we experience it and we feel a certain culture, how do we start to change it and mold it and shape it? Is we need to then understand, well, what are some of the things that link what we're doing behind the scenes in the boardroom to the front lines of the organizations? And some of those words are norms. Is that the discussion at the moment around how do we think about shaping culture is, it's about taking the values and asking the what does it look like question, which is essentially the norm question. What are the norms for shaping or molding behavior? And then asking the question, how do we express or put those norms into mechanisms or tools that we can use as leaders to communicate the tone at the top right through to the behavior at the bottom? And one of the challenges of that is between the top and the bottom, the tone at the top and the behavior at the bottom is what's termed the mood in the middle. Is that the role of management in a company is to convey the message, but also shape the behavior. And that's often the challenge in companies that change and grow, is do we also ensure that those who are carriers of culture from top to bottom are also aligned in terms of values. And so one of the key things as well is then to, when we've spoken about it, to demonstrate it. In the likes of the King codes of corporate governance, even in the new code, the ISO 37000 standard, which is about the governance of organizations, there are a number of phrases that have to do with what the role of the board is in engaging with values and culture ultimately. And one of the key phrases is that the board, individually and collectively, which means it's a demonstration not just of the group, but also each individual, because as leaders in business, whether we're directors or senior managers, we have a role of leadership, and we need to individually and corporately exhibit, which is demonstrate, and cultivate things like responsibility, accountability, fairness, transparency, which are in a governance space the foundation stones of effective governance. But we all need to ask the question, well, what does that look like in my own life? What does it look like in the boardroom? If we in the boardroom are expecting performance from our companies, then what does it mean to perform in the boardroom? What does it mean to measure our own performance, evaluate our own performance, and demonstrate that to the company, that actually we're not just the oversight looking at you to try to perform, but actually we are critical, we are skeptical of our own behavior, our own performance. And so demonstrating it is really important. And this shifts the thinking to what I like to call the disciplines of leaders, or the leadership disciplines that are really, really important. Because ultimately culture is visible and made visible by the activities of leaders in organizations. And the cluster of disciplines that does that is what I like to call the disciplines of the heart, the head, and the hands. You see, directors are legally obliged to act with care, with skill, and with diligence. And I would argue that those are best reflected in saying, how do we act with the care towards the company and those in the company, those outside of the company who experience it? Well, we need to think about, how do we express that care? What does care look like in the boardroom, from the boardroom to society at large? The skill sets of directors are primarily around thinking and engaging with critical thinking, understanding culture, understanding the impact, understanding the elements of culture in terms of norms and behaviors. But also, what do we do? What are some of the things that we actually put in place as leaders to mold or shape culture? And that's when we think about, well, it's taking it from the demonstration. So I need to be this thing, but I also need to nurture it. And the tool for nurturing is where we start thinking about, well, is culture something that is engineered? Is it something that is built or constructed? Or is there something else about culture that is slightly different? And I would argue that the moment we think about culture as something we can build or engineer, we once again get our metaphors mixed up, because culture, the word culture, comes from an agricultural root word, cultivate. And so as we are thinking about the structures and the systems of the business, which is what governors do, is they use structures and systems, policies, processes, procedures, all of those kind of things ultimately are tools of governors. But those are the things we do construct, but we construct them to cultivate something else. Because it's not the structure of governance that is important. It's the thing that the structure results in that is important. Best metaphor for that is a vineyard, is that ultimately a vineyard, in order for a vineyard to be effective, a vineyard to be, grow a good crop that can be harvested, it doesn't just need the vine, it needs a set of trellises for the vine to grow on. And so that's the good metaphor to think about when we engage with organizational culture is to ask the question, what are the systems and structures in place that are promoting the right thing, motivating the right thing, incentivizing the right thing, holding accountable the right thing in our organizations? Because that's ultimately what governance thinking comprises of. Is it comprises of things like accountability, responsibility, fairness, decision making. And so when we start thinking about how do we nurture this thing called culture, it's also how do we not only nurture it, but how do we embed it in our organizations? So for an organization to be sustainable in the long term or over the long term, there needs to be some structure and substance to a company. We can't just have a set of people who work together randomly and engage with one another randomly. We've got to ask the question, what is the enabling culture, the way we do things around here, that is ultimately going to enable us to achieve our strategic objective? And so in embedding it is where we start thinking about the tools and the systems and the documents ultimately that start to describe this thing called culture and embed it into the ongoing activities of the business. And this is where we do look at something like policy and what policy does ultimately. As we go, please, if there are any questions, I've now been flowing through in terms of just unpacking this flow of thinking as opposed to as separate things. But if there's something that you'd like clarity on, please also jump in the chat box or questions in the Q&A box. We've got a couple more slides to go to kind of wrap it up, but I'd love to also explore any examples in your own business around that. So if we think about embedding it, it boils down to essentially, what does a policy framework ultimately do? A policy framework takes decisions that are made, creates actions in the business. So decisions are often made in the boardroom or delegated down to senior positions in a business. Those result in actions where activities happen, and everybody in a business, whatever size or structure, is performing activities that are intended ultimately to reflect the decisions made in the business. And those actions of the business ultimately have an impact. And that impact is measured from the outside looking in by the stakeholders. And so is it meeting expectations? Is it fulfilling our needs? Is it delivering what we are, specifically engaging around? And a policy framework ultimately is the thing that takes a decision into an appropriate action and has the right impact. The challenge being that all of our decisions, undergirding all of our decisions, so the gap I've got there on the left-hand side is where the intangibles, where the invisibles exist. You see, decisions, actions and impact are visible. Decision is, in a sense, the bridge, and decisions ultimately, the way we engage in decision-making in our businesses, the things we're expected to do, the inputs into the decision, the way we think about the decisions would reflect ultimately what we truly believe to be valuable. And so the left-hand leg here is the one of thinking and values. And so where policy ultimately takes the decisions through action to impact, it's our internal board processes. And I would argue that that phrase board processes could be replaced with decision-making processes, the way we make decisions, the way we think about the things, the input we get into those decisions in the form of, at a board level, board packs, elsewhere, reporting, etc. All of those things that enable us to think about the implications of decisions ultimately reflect the values, the things we truly believe to be valuable. And so when we're embedding organizational culture from a governance level down, we've got to ask the question, how robust is our policy framework? Does it truly ensure that the right things are done as a result of the decisions? But are we also taking into account the other leg of the diagram? Are we thinking about our values, our beliefs in the way we make decisions, in the kind of things that shape our decisions, in the kind of things that form our decisions, the kinds of information that we're asking, the kinds of questions we're thinking as part of our decision-making process are critical because they reflect our values. And where the challenge comes in is that ultimately, as I've been saying, organizational culture is not something that is, in terms of being tested. It's not ultimately tested in terms of what we say about ourselves. It's ultimately tested by the experience of those outside looking in. And when someone is impacted by the actions of our business, they don't work their way back through actions, decisions, how did you think about it, what did you value? Essentially what they do is they jump straight from impact to values. And this is in a sense, the dangerous space of organizational culture, is we can say a lot of things, we can use a lot of words to describe organizational culture, but we need to understand that it's those behaviors on the front line of the business, the norms on the front line of the business, the actions that are happening that lead to the impact or the consequence that ultimately are the carriers of culture right to the front line. And that's why things like trust, reputation are so important to think about in our organizations. And lastly, we've got to ask the question, how do we actually get in touch with those things? How do we monitor and ongoingly mold? I almost had 7 and 8, but I thought we've said we're going to talk about 7 things, but I could separate those even into 7 and 8, because molding takes it back to the top and says, how do we, again, loop back to understand, experience, etc. But one of the big challenges, obviously, is identifying what are the significant, pertinent, legitimate measures of culture in your organization. And those are obviously things that are not always that easy to find, because they have to do with perception, they have to do with trust, they have to do with reputation, all of those people elements that we spoke about when we touched on the Edelman survey up front. We've got to ask ourselves the question, are the people in our business able to identify and align with the values and purpose that we have, expressed? And are we true to ourselves? Do we, in a sense, have integrity in the fact that what people experience on the outside and what we say about ourselves on the inside are the same thing? And those are some tough questions that governors, senior managers need to continually ask themselves on an ongoing basis. And so that, in a nutshell, are some of the things that are really important in thinking about culture, taking it from the back office, in a sense, to the front office, making sure that it's also not just nurtured or demonstrated, but also nurtured. So it's not just being someone who reflects values, but how in our organizations do we also nurture it? So we make sure that the company houses the values that we believe are important. And then how do we embed them in our systems and structures and processes? So those are some key things from my side. Any questions, comments would be valuable. I always like to leave 15-20 minutes for questions as we go, and I'd love to get those. And if you'd like to ask a question, we're not a huge group, and I'd like to open for questions. And I'd like to also unpack, just as we close, a couple of next steps where we can certainly help you. But I believe if you want to ask a question, verbally, as opposed to type it into the chat box, you're welcome to indicate that. I do have the attendees list open in front of me. Any thoughts, questions, comments, anything that stood out from you or for you from this presentation? Again, just looking at going back to the 7 ways. Good question, Elani. The typical structure of a board. Elani, can I ask you to give a bit more elaboration? I'm going to allow you to talk, so you can unmute yourself, and then maybe just ask the question, just to get more context for that.
Yes. Thanks. It was very enlightening. Thank you. Just a quick question. I'm thinking a typical board for a small company. I'm talking 130 million turnover per year, staff members of about 25. What would that board look like? It's family owned, families all in the trust. Trust is the shareholders. What kind of positions would you put on that board?
So remember that the typical board is what we call a unitary board, a combination of executives and non-executives, and some independents as the non-executives. Typically, the first step is if the family, if is currently everybody involved in the family or in the business, Elani?
Yeah. So the trust consists of 4 people, and all 4 people is also employees.
Okay. So in a sense, everybody's doing everything. A good first step to take is to start thinking, what is the, is there something strategically that we require, and can we bring someone in as an independent onto the board, one or two people, and that level of turnover. You're still a small staff complement, but that level of turnover is certainly one where it's important to think about, because there's a significant financial impact.
Yes.
It's not insignificant, and I think that's really important. We're also arguing, and if I can also shape this conversation a bit in terms of culture, what is really important at a certain level in a family business is to start asking the question, it boils down to saying there could be the same values undergirding both the business and the family, absolutely legitimately, but often the expression of the values, what it looks like, would be different in the family versus in the business. And it's helpful, especially if there's a long-term view, to ensure that there's, that both are sustainable and there's not a danger of, a conflict of interest and those kind of things, is to put in place things like family charters, family constitutions, which would house the family values or the family expression, and then have a workshop around, well, what does this look like in the business? Especially as we grow and expand. And I think that's a good next step. And then part of that process would be to say, how can we separate the thinking governing the family, governing the business? And that's where, and that's certainly where we can help us. Sadara, maybe in the poll, I'm going to put up a poll in a couple of slides, and we do offer with all of our webinars a 30-minute consult where we can dive into a couple of the other details with one of our senior partners and understand that, if that's helpful. Great.
No, looking forward to it.
Okay, so let me drop that poll up right now while I've got it. I just need to find the right button, and I see that Yuri, great. I love that phrase. I've actually never heard it, but it's in Afrikaans nie. So it's a powerful, phrase there. A screw turns down from its head. Exactly. I mean, if that's not an illustration or demonstration of what the role of a board is really important. Too often we think this thing is operational when actually it's governance, and it's separating what is governance thinking. So we've put in a couple of, on the poll you will have seen a couple of options, so a couple of ways that we can engage. And I know this was a short introduction, happy to get other questions. So we also do training. Just as you think of questions as well, we're engaged quite strongly in boardroom level training with both family businesses, private businesses, other businesses. We combine a whole lot of technical experience, bring in templates and tools. But our key, I suppose, approach in our training is to be as practical as possible. We have an 11-month program called the Applied Directorship Program. You'll see that's mentioned. Some of our other training options. The ADP, you see at the top there, is the Applied Directorship Program. It's an 11-month program that really seeks to unpack, if I want to put up a couple of concepts here, directorship. What does it mean to be a director? What does it mean to be in a board? Lani, your question around composing a board would be something that we'd unpack in quite a lot of detail on that. What is the structure of a typical board? What are the steps to take? As well as what does a board engage around? What we would call an applied boardroom methodology, consisting of everything from organizational culture, strategy, things like risk governance, stakeholder engagement, all of those themes that are out there in the boardroom space, but also in the corporate space. Things like ESG. How do we deal with that in an applied manner? And all of it aimed at saying, if we can get it right, ultimately, the role of a board is to unlock boardroom performance. And so unlocking boardroom performance unlocks company performance. And that's really the end result of good governance, is it results in an effective company. And right now, effectiveness may simply be surviving, given what's happened in the last couple of years. But it could be growth. It could be strategically expansion or diversification. It's also about accountability for companies to work. And this is why this conversation around organizational culture is really, really important, because ultimately the board is accountable for everything that happens within the business. And so culture is not something we can ignore as boards and even as senior leaders. And some of you are probably wearing a couple of hats if you are sitting at a senior position in a company and maybe the board role isn't that well defined. You're probably carrying some of the governance accountability as well. And then ultimately, it's about the sustainability of the business, the viability of the business over time. And so that's what we structure the training around. That's also what we're happy to have. As I mentioned, we are one of the things, the consult. We do that as a standard offer in all of our webinars and partner webinars as well. So thanks to LabourNet for also facilitating this as well, because your questions are specific to you as well. And then mention there as well other board services. Appreciate the thanks for the presentation. So if there are no other questions, comments, and I know that I have got a looming load shedding deadline, which if it hits, if I disappear, it's because something is turning on in the background, and even though I've got backups, etc., it always does drop the line. So Warren, over to you. If there's any questions or comments you have, will be valuable.
Thanks, Roger. That was great. Sorry, I did drop off for a little bit, so I'm going to blame load shedding, and I'm checking out my battery here, so it's diminishing. But again, yeah, I suppose load shedding is something we've got to build into our businesses as well. So just, last comment on me on culture is, it's just so important that it comes from the top down, your value systems, how you run your business, how you treat your people. But if you ask a lot of people also what's culture, some people say, no, we get together on Fridays for a braai, after work drinks or something. So people have got very different definitions of culture. And I think this conversation's a longer one than the session we've had with you. So definitely I'd like to team up with you guys again, just to expand on this discussion. And then just lastly, before I close out, I just want to thank the delegates for attending, and please also just and obviously to yourself, Roger, but to the delegates, just keep an eye out for an email you're going to receive from Serdar with a link to the webinar recording, so that you can just view it again or refer back to it if necessary. And then if there's any post webinar questions, you've definitely got Serdar's details or my details. So please just pop us a message and we'll be in touch with you guys. So thanks for that, and thanks again, Roger.
Warren. It was a privilege, and if there's any questions, as Warren said, please do not hesitate to get hold of us. All the best.